We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll introduce us and turn you over to Murray Stein in just a moment. Before I give you the formal introduction, there's a young lady next to me that I'd like to introduce for a moment. She, Andy McDowell is her name, and Murray, I told you a little bit about Andy, perhaps coming. The segue into Andy is this book, Jung's Map of the Soul, written by, Murray Stein, of course. And this is a wonderful introduction text, to Jungian psychology, and many have used it to get a sense of what the Jungians are like. And this book has been just an excellent introductory text. Andy McDowell has read the book herself and was so moved by it that she wrote a introduction in Oprah's magazine of the 5 or 6 books that most affected her in her life in a positive way, and Murray Stein's was one of them. Murray called me up and said, Andy McDowell has reviewed my book, and you all may want to know about that. That might help you in this seminar coming up. And I said, well, not only that, but she lives across the street, from us, right here in the Asheville. Not literally, but down the road a short ways. And we called up Andy McDowell, who agreed to come, was interested in coming. And all I wanted to do at this point is just let Andy speak for a moment or two about the book that she wrote and go from there. Those of you who don't know her, I think most people do, but actress, model, working on Footloose right now, I think.
Footloose is the biggest one that's going to be coming out in the fall. A big commercial, yes, so that should be really big.
Yeah, and Groundhog Day is still one of my favorites,
yes.
As 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Those are my 2 top picks. But anyway, here's Andy to just share a couple moments about our book and our seminar today.
Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to participate.
Absolutely.
I did love the book. I found it as someone who has been doing a lot of searching and wanting to understand myself on a deeper level, and I really like this Jungian's type of work. And as a layperson, quite often it's complex, and people will write in a way that it's too difficult for me to comprehend. And I particularly liked Map of the Soul because I felt that it was something that I could digest and assimilate myself, and it didn't speak over my head. So I think anybody that would be interested in learning more about how to use this type of therapy, or getting to know themselves, or looking inward, or using their dreams, or becoming more evolved, or knowing or understanding their dark side and what that means, this is a perfect book for the person that really is not a therapist or a trained doctor. So that's why of all of the ones that I have read, I enjoyed this one the most. And I'm glad to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak, because regardless to the fact that I feel it was easy to understand, I still think it's really complex. And having the opportunity to hear Murray speak about it today is really exciting for me, because I'm sure that I will learn more and easier for me in my process of becoming fully evolved, which is my goal to be before I die, if that's possible.
Exactly. We're all working on it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your presence here.
Okay.
It's a delight to have you. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so we will now get going with a formal introduction. Thanks again to Andy McDowell for being here. She's one of our Asheville celebrities, and we were delighted to have her join us today. So yet again, we are very happy to have so many people from around the world joining us. As usual, I read off the list of countries joining us today, and it is over 30 now, and the numbers keep growing. When we first started, we had 2, Mexico and the United States, then Canada joined, and now we're up to 30. So over 3 years, this has really taken off. So a big thank you to the wide internet audience that's attending today. The countries that are represented include Australia, which is 2 in the morning, I think, in Australia, so they may watch it tape. The brave souls in Australia might get up early for it. But Australia, Brazil, Bermuda, Canada, Colombia, Cyprus, France, Germany, Greece, Hong Kong, India, Iran, Israel, Japan, Mexico, Netherlands, Nigeria, Norway, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Russia, Slovenia, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Venezuela, and of course the United States. And 2 points I want to raise with this. Our global vision is one of a global community of people around the world kind of connecting here. And you see that in the Twitter interactions, in the blog, back and forth discussion. We've had over 300 comments from our blog worldwide, which is fabulous. The person from Japan that joined us is from Kofu, Japan today. Kofu is just outside of Tokyo. So you can imagine what they're going through. They are not that far from the Fukushima incident. So if you're attending live Japan, we would love to hear any comments that you might want to offer, and if not, please send us a note afterwards to let us know how things are there. The other impressive comment I want to read real quickly is from New Zealand, and they're not able to make it today, but you'll hear why in a moment. This is from Joy in Christchurch, New Zealand, and her note says, "Dear Steve, thank you for the seminar. I am one of the analysts who live in Christchurch, New Zealand. Our city, as you know, has been devastated by an earthquake, and we are all in a survival mode down here. Would love to hear the seminar later when we can. In the meantime, your prayers and thoughts for the city and its people are appreciated. The outpouring of support from all over the world, especially the United States, has been heartwarming and quite phenomenal in its scale. Kind regards and thank you all for your work. Joy Ryan Bloor." And that's just, we've had a number of comments like that. We had a comment from Pakistan after the flood. We've had a comment from Tehran during some incidences. This phenomenon has really taken through the world, and we are so delighted to have people joining in that regards. Real briefly, our focus are live seminars like today. We also have DVD recordings of the seminars that are available on the website, AshevilleYoungCenter.org. We have social media arm, which is Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Those are quite active. And then we have the regular blog that we're seeing lots and lots of comments of. So we're very, very pleased to have those pieces as well. A few quick thank yous. As always, thank you to the University of North Carolina, Asheville. That's where we are seated right now. They are really the hub of this, and we're using their technology to spread throughout the world. That's connected to what's called the NC-REN system, which is in Raleigh, North Carolina. They're the actual hub that connects in the other places. The Distance Learning Center is here, and the Department of Psychology is hosting us as well. A strong thank you to the ETH, which is a university in Switzerland, also known as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and they are hosting Murray Stein and a group of both analysts and students from his institute there. ETH is where Carl Jung himself was a professor, so there's a very nice historical connection with ETH. ISAP Zurich. ISAP is the International School of Analytical Psychology. That's the school that Murray Stein is the president of, and we really appreciate their support. They've loaned us many of their analysts over the last 3 years and have been just wonderful in helping us with that. And Centro Mexicano de C.J. Jung hopefully is going to join us. I've heard there's some technical issues. I'm going to step off camera in a moment to make sure they're connected soon if we can. But they ought to be connected in a little bit as well. And Patricia Michan is our lead person there. A few housekeeping pieces, and then we'll be done. First of all, I'm required to announce that we have no commercial support for the presenters, the topics, or the programs. There is no pharmaceutical industry support of any kind associated with us today. We will be sending out a survey later today about today's seminar, so you should get an email with a brief survey. If you get a chance, please do answer that. That helps us plan and improve our processes here. I do want to warn people that we are recording today, so any comments or questions could be on the DVD. So if you're a very introverted person and don't want to be recorded, write out your question, hand it to me, and I'll read it out today. And you should have this already, but send any questions for the internet folks to info@AshevilleYoungCenter.org. info@AshevilleYoungCenter.org, and that's on the emails that we've been sending to you. Please turn off all cell phones if you're in a live site that could beep. And there will be one 15-minute break about halfway through the 3-hour seminar today. So let me introduce to you Murray Stein. Murray is so well known to our audiences here, I think he needs little introduction. Nonetheless, I want to say that he's the current president of the International Psychology, full analyst trained at Zurich. He is a founding member of the Chicago Jung Institute from many years back, as well as other institutions. He was the former president of the IAAP, International Association of Analytical Psychologists, which is our main kind of governing board, for the Jungian analyst community, and is a author, of course. Jung's Map of the Soul, which we've already sent out notices about. His latest book, which is fantastic. It's a more in-depth book called Jungian Psychoanalysis in the Spirit of Carl Jung. That's available on Amazon or any of the usual channels, and it's a very good book, much more in-depth, and he's edited a number of contributions from that. So, without further ado, I offer to you Dr. Murray Stein.
Thank you. I'm with some friends here in Zurich as well.
We don't have audio yet. Can we turn on audio mic in Zurich?
Chris?
Yep, that's better. Yeah, go ahead, Murray. I think we have you now.
Okay. You got it now? Okay.
Yeah, low volume. If we can turn up the volume a little bit, at least in our setting, that would be good. But yes, go ahead.
I was just saying that I'm here with friends from the International School in Zurich, and at some point the camera may also focus on some of them if they want to participate and ask them questions. So I'm not alone in this room, even though all you see right now is me. And I don't know, can you see these notes that I'm putting up there on the other screen? Are those available to you? The title of this seminar is Caring for the Soul, an Introduction to Jungian Psychotherapy for Patients and Therapists. And I want to give kind of a broad and general introduction to what Jungian psychotherapy, Jungian work is, and its history, and sort of bring it up to date where it is today. I'm going to entertain questions from the audience that you might have about what do people expect from Jungian analysis when they consider going into it? What are they looking for? What are some of their doubts and anxieties and fears? Maybe we can settle some of those questions or answer some of them. So I want to be quite open in this to questions and discussion. I'm going to start by giving a quick historical overview and review of what Jungian psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is, where it comes from, its history, and where it is today. And then I'll say a few words about the stages of the therapeutic process and what some of the goals are. I think those of you who have tried to enter into any kind of psychotherapy and have had that experience realize that it is a very engaging process that brings out aspects of your self, of your memory, of your history that you perhaps had buried and pushed away at some point, and encourages you to integrate those pieces and bring yourself up to date to create a current narrative of who you are and what you are. And Jungian psychotherapy isn't so different, but I will try to point out some of the unique features of the Jungian approach as we go along as well. So let me start with a kind of historical overview. And let me see if I can get that on the screen for you there. This is in my imperfect handwriting, and I'll go over it so you can make some sense of it as we go along. What this is a timeline. Where we are today in 2011 is almost exactly 100 years since analytical psychology as a separated from Freudian psychoanalysis discipline was founded. On June 6th of this year in Zurich, we will be commemorating Jung's 50th death anniversary. That is, he died on June 6th, 1961. So 50 years exactly have passed since Jung's death. And it was just about exactly 50 years before he died that he founded the field. So the field of analytical psychology is just about exactly 100 years old. And it was occupied in the first half of its existence by the dominating, towering figure of C.G. Jung. In the second half of its existence, it has been occupied and filled out and extended by a host of very gifted second, third, and fourth, even now fifth generation Jungian analysts. And I'll try to give an indication of what that development has been since 1961. But first, let me start with the origins and give you a very quick summary of the early history of analytical psychology, how it developed, why it developed, and the distance that Jung brought it in his lifetime. So the top line indicates Jung's lifeline. He was born in 1875, and he died in 1961. So 1875, he's 0, and by 1900, he's 25 years old. You could say that the first 25 years of his life were occupied, as it is by all of us, with your childhood, your youth, your early educational experiences. And Jung lived a fairly typical Swiss middle-class life in that respect. He had a good education. It was in the classics, in a classic European tradition. So he learned Latin and Greek. He learned mathematics. He wasn't any good at mathematics, failed that subject, but he was very good at languages. And he came from a family in which there were basically two professions. It was a professional family. On the one hand, they were ministers in the Swiss Protestant Church, and some very important figures in that respect. And on the other hand, they were medical doctors. So on his father's side, his father was actually a Swiss Reformed minister, so he grew up in a parsonage, and in the setting of the Swiss Reformed Church. But his father's father was a towering figure, a gigantic figure in Basel at the university, where he landed after fleeing from Germany during one of the revolutions in the 19th century, ended up in Basel as a professor of medicine, and became one of the leading figures at the university. I think ended up actually as the rector. And Jung's father was born from his third wife. There were 13 children in that family, 13 children also in his mother's family. His mother's father was the head of the, of the large cathedral in Basel. It's called the Antestes, like a bishop of the Basel clergy. And so he had these two strong influences, and he chose to go into medicine. That doesn't mean that he wasn't interested in theology. He could have also been a great theologian, a great preacher, I think, and he did occasionally show the spark of the preaching gene when he had the opportunity. Very charismatic lecturer and speaker. But he chose science instead as his main preoccupation and occupation, and entered into the medical school at the University of Basel, finished his medical studies in exactly 1900. So that's his early years. It's covered very nicely in his autobiography. Just to pick up on something that Andy McDowell said about books impressing one or changing one, the book that impressed me, I guess, more than any other single book in my life and changed my life completely to the extent that it's never been the same since, was Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's autobiography, which I bought as a 25-year-old in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s, at a very turbulent time in American history and in my own personal history, very formative years. From the moment I picked that book up, couldn't understand a lot of it, had to look in the glossary to figure out what these terms like shadow and animus and anima and libido and all these terms that Jung uses in there one time or another, what they meant and tried to figure out what he was saying. But what really fascinated me and caught my attention and wouldn't let me go was his very deep appreciation of dreams and what dreams meant in his life. And I'd never considered that before. My education was literary and theology and philosophy and languages. Nobody had ever mentioned the importance of dreams, including in my family. We didn't pay any attention to them. And suddenly it occurred to me there's a whole side of life that I'd been missing. So I started recording my dreams madly and realized that I had one almost every night. Couldn't understand them or make heads or tails of them, of course. But just noticing them and recording them brought a great deal of life and energy to me at the time. And so having picked that book up, which Jung wrote in his old age, one of the last things he worked on before he died, was actually published the year after his death, way over here in 1961, 62, I think the book was published, really summarizes the inner life that Jung lived and found so important from his childhood on. And so you get these two dimensions of life from his autobiography. The outer dimension, what he calls personality number one, the social personality, the person we are with other people and in our time and in our society and in our families and so on. And then there's another personality, personality number two, which is much older, which is much wiser in some ways, which is much closer to our bodies and to our instincts and to our, what he would eventually call our archetypal makeup. A much older figure. And putting these two together in his autobiography, I found absolutely fascinating and engaging. And I guess that's what I've been trying to do myself ever since, and helping other people to do. Put together these two sides of their lives, the conscious side, their conscious memories, and the unconscious side, their dreams, their fantasies, their imagination. And trying to integrate the personality through that kind of work, which is really what Jungian psychotherapy is all about. So going back to pick up Jung again in 1900, that's when he moved from Basel to Zurich and took up the study of psychiatry. And at the Berkholzli Clinic in Zurich with a then very well-known professor of psychiatry named Eugen Bleuler, whose great contribution to the field was to create the word schizophrenia, to replace what had previously been called dementia precox. Thank you. My students are ahead of me. Dementia precox, which is like an early dementia. That's the way schizophrenia was looked upon. Precocious dementia. You aren't supposed to become demented until you're my age, until you're in your 60s or 70s. But dementia precox is an early form of dementia, and schizophrenia means two-mindedness, of two minds, split-mindedness. And that was Eugen Bleuler's famous contribution to psychiatry. And Eugen Bleuler also introduced Jung to Freud. Freud was busy in Vienna at the time, and in 1900, exactly the year that Jung began his psychiatric studies in Zurich, Freud published what is probably his greatest and most famous book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And Eugen Bleuler, who was very up-to-date and conversant with the literature in the field, suggested to Jung that he get that book and review it for his psychiatric student colleagues, the other men who were studying at the Berkholzli with him at the time. And so he did that, and that was his introduction to Freud, actually. And he was very taken with some of Freud's ideas, particularly Freud's notion of the unconscious. And Jung had been looking around for something to describe this other side of his life and his experience. So he came upon the notion of the importance of dreams from a scientific point of view through Freud's early work. And later he established a relationship with Freud, and they exchanged a lot of letters which have been published in the Freud-Jung letters now. And he went to visit Freud in Vienna. His first meeting with Freud, actually in the flesh, was in Vienna at Freud's home, where he went to visit him with his wife. And the wives spent their time, whatever they were doing, and the men sat for 13 hours in Freud's study and talked nonstop about psychoanalysis. And this was Jung's initiation into psychoanalytic thinking, which he then took back to the hospital in Zurich, where he had been already attempting to practice a bit of psychoanalysis on some of his patients, famously on a Russian woman named Sabina Spielrein, who came to the Berkholzli Clinic in 1904 when she was, I think, 17 years old. And Jung's probably first analytic case was Sabina Spielrein, where he used some of Freud's ideas about repression and the unconscious and early trauma and so on to help to bring her out of her very troubled state, and within 6 months she could be discharged from the hospital, and she seemed to be fine. She stayed in Zurich, went to the university. Women were not allowed to study in universities in Russia. She was a Russian Jew whose father had enough wherewithal to send her abroad to study, and so she spent the next, 10 years or so in Switzerland for getting a doctorate at the University of Zurich. Jung was her teacher and her dissertation advisor. They also had a famous personal relationship. There will be a film on that subject coming out this year sometime called The Most Dangerous Method. Andy McDowell, I don't think, is in that film. Somebody else is playing Sabina Spielrein, unfortunately. I think Andy McDowell would have made a wonderful Sabina. But Jung was fascinated by her. She had a great mind, and she actually made a significant contribution to psychoanalysis in her doctoral dissertation by writing about the death instinct. And Jung picks up on that in his early work on the Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, the transformations and symbols of the libido, where he writes extensively about the death instinct and gives her credit for it. She then went to, just this is a side note, but an interesting one, I think, she then went to Vienna and studied with Freud and became a psychoanalyst under his tutoring there. And he picked up on the idea of the death instinct and incorporated it into his theory later when he wrote The Ego and the Id, 1920, I think that was published. And I think he gives her credit also. I'm not sure about that. But that was a major contribution to psychoanalytic theory. Jung dropped the idea of the death instinct, by the way. When he revised the book and published it again in 1950, it's now called Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5 of the collected works. He excised pretty much everything about the death instinct. He lost faith in that instinct. And he had 5 others to talk about instead, and he had the archetypes and a lot of other things to include that he didn't have in 1912. So Sabina Spielrein faded into history, tragically dying in Russia at the hands of the Germans in the early 1940s. Her brother was killed by Stalin. Her brother was also a psychoanalytic educator who was very privileged under Lenin. Lenin set up a school for the children of the top leaders of the Communist Party in Moscow in the early 1920s. When Lenin died and Stalin took over, Stalin didn't want to have anything to do with psychoanalysis. He was very suspicious of it. He didn't like people talking privately anywhere that he couldn't listen into. And so he closed the school. Sabina Spielrein, who had in the meantime moved to Russia also to participate in that school, moved back to her home. And Stalin killed her brother in the 1930s, and the Germans killed her and her children in the early 1940s. Very sad story. A nice film has been made, though, called My Name is Sabina Spielrein. It's a documentary made by a Swedish filmmaker, and you probably can find it on YouTube or online. Ich hieß Sabine Spielrein in German. And the dialogue and the text are taken from letters and diaries. Very well acted. About the time that Sabine Spielrein went to Vienna, Jung broke with Freud. And this was a momentous event in the history of psychoanalysis, because Jung had been identified by Freud as his crown prince and his heir. Freud had the fantasy from early on that he would die young. He didn't actually die that young. I think he died at around the age of 80. But he thought he would die young. He had some sort of numerology notion based on a prediction that somebody made, I think. I don't know the details of that. But he, already in his 50s, was looking around for a successor, and he found Jung. And Jung, who was about 30 years old when he met Freud, was a very likely candidate, because Jung was full of energy, full of ideas, and became like the main charging forward hero, battling for psychoanalysis in the world of psychiatry in the German-speaking Europe. Freud himself did not have entree to those circles, partly because he was Jewish, but partly because he wasn't a psychiatrist. He was a neurologist. And Jung represented the entry into the Gentile world and into the Gentile medical world, the world of psychiatry. And Jung carried the banner, and he held it high, and he fought hard until he lost faith in Freud and in the direction that Freud's thinking was taking, and mostly in Freud's need to be on top and hold authority. Jung felt he wasn't scientific enough. He was too dogmatic. He wanted his own ideas to be dominant in psychoanalysis. That was Jung's take on it. And being a Swiss, very independent-minded, he could tolerate that only so long, and finally he did break with Freud. But he had learned a lot from Freud. And you could call these early years until 1913 or so, years of learning and apprenticeship, psychiatry, Freudian psychoanalysis, plus what Jung had picked up at the university. He studied philosophy quite deeply. He had read Nietzsche, he had read Kant. He was interested in theology. He wrote a paper on 19th century liberal Protestant theologian named Ritschl. He had wide interests. So these early years, and then very intensively beginning around 1910, 1909, 1910, the studies that went into the creation of his work, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, the transformations and symbols of the libido, included a wealth of philosophical texts, religious texts from all over the world, esoteric and heretical texts from Western tradition and Oriental traditions and all over the place. Fairy tales, myths, you name it, even American mythology. The story of Hiawatha, American story, is commented on extensively in that work. And all of this culminated in 1912 and 1913 in the publication of his book, with which he broke with Freud, and then went into a prolonged period of deep introspection. I call it the Red Book period. We've had a couple of sessions on the Red Book. It's now been published nearly 100 years after Jung began it, published last year, 2 years ago now. In this Red Book period, Jung withdrew from a lot of his outer activities. He withdrew from the university. He withdrew from Freudian psychoanalysis. He resigned his presidency at the International Psychoanalytic Association. He was the first president of it. And he really went into a deep period of introversion and introspection. Not that he didn't carry on with his outer life. He had a family, he had 5 children, he lived in Zurich, Küsnacht. He had patients, he lectured, he traveled as much as he could. When World War I broke out in 1914, he was in Scotland lecturing. And that was in the middle of the most intense time of his Red Book experience as well. So it isn't that he left everything and suddenly retreated into a cave, but you could say he lived a day world and he lived a night world. In the daytime, he lectured and he traveled and he saw his patients and he spent time with his family. They went camping regularly on the lake. His son told me one time, his son, Franz Jung, I asked his son, well, how was your father really strange in those years, when he was this confrontation with the unconscious that he writes about in his autobiography? And his son said, we didn't notice anything. We went camping like everybody else on the lake, and we had picnics, and he was just a regular father. He liked to sail. I went sailing with him. He taught me how to sail. So I don't think the family noticed too much of a difference. But at night, I think Jung was very preoccupied, and in his free time, you can see the intensity of his inner work in the Red Book and the amount of energy and time he put into that. And those years were really the making of laying the foundations for what would become what we know today as analytical psychology. So here, you could say the birth of analytical psychology takes place in about 1912, 1913. That's when Jung first used the term after the break with Freud and the Viennese. In Zurich, they started calling his school, the Zurich school, they started calling it analytical psychology. In 1916, the Psychological Club was founded in Zurich. Those were people gathered around Jung who supported his ideas and his vision and his view of things. So he had some students around him. His wife was actively involved, Emma Jung. She was the first president of the Psychological Club. Tony Wolff, his other partner, his co-partner and a co-worker who had begun her involvement in psychoanalysis already in 1912 when she traveled with Jung and Emma to a congress in Germany. I think it was in Weimar. You see her on that famous picture with all the Jung and Freud and about 100 others at that congress before the break. And she was at his side, and together with Edith McCormick Rockefeller from Chicago, who was living here during the First World War, who provided the money. She was a Rockefeller, she had lots of it. She bought a house for the Psychological Club, which will be celebrating its 100th birthday in 2016, still in the same house. So it has longevity. And at the Psychological Club, Jung started to expand on some of his ideas from a theoretical point of view. The Red Book is really a personal, private diary where you get his experience and his very private reflections on his experiences, attempts to understand his experience and amplify his experiences through the use of images, paintings, and so on. But in his writings and in his lectures, he was trying to take that to another level. And write about what he was discovering in his own inner journey and with some of his patients in a theoretical way. So the source of the 2 essays in analytical psychology, the roots are in these years. That's volume 7 of the collected works. And there Jung really lays out a process of a psychodynamic process of development. He lays out a program of analysis, starting with the persona, the shadow, these terms that I write about in Jung's Map of the Soul, analyzing the persona, analyzing the shadow, looking at the ego, getting past all of that to deeper levels, to the anima and the animus, finally to the self. The dangers of all this, of becoming infected, becoming inflated by these powerful forces in the unconscious. He writes about the mana personality, that's the inflated personality, something he was somewhat in danger of becoming himself because he became very close to some of these inner figures, but you see him struggling to separate and differentiate himself from them in the Red Book. Very important work of individuation, to separate creates separations and distinctions between the ego and other figures of the inner world, not just between oneself and other people, which is the usual understanding of individuation. It is that as well. To become an individual means to come to yourself and not project onto other people parts of yourself or identify with them, but to find yourself in yourself. That's the meaning of individuation on one level. Another level is to identify those parts that belong to you in a deep inner sense, the inner figures that you locate in dreams or active imagination, and create dialogues but also distinctions from them, not to identify from them. The danger there is, as I say, to become inflated, to lose yourself, to lose your identity, and become a kind of stereotype. This is a danger on other levels as well. If you become famous, a celebrity, or you become very successful in a profession, you know, your wife starts calling you senator at home, and in the bedroom, you know there's something amiss. You're identified with a role. So people who are successful and who love what they're doing and have these roles made available to them by society tend to identify with them very understandably. That's called identification with a persona, a publicly recognizable role, and there is a need to differentiate the ego, one's identity, from that. Similarly, from the inner figures that come up and can grab you from the other side. Where are we? In 1920, if you take away Jung's first 5 years and you start in 1880 instead of 1875, and he dies in 1961, this is exactly halfway through his life. In 1920, he is 45 years old. He will live to be 86. And he's now just coming out of his Red Book period, out of the intensity of it, although he doesn't stop working on it until about 1930. But he really enters another phase of his life, and another phase of analytical psychology is beginning to bloom. The field is beginning to grow in the sense that after the First World War, students from abroad started coming to study with Jung. And these became a very important set of figures that would carry the field further and carry it far, far afield into distant lands and other countries. And so students came from England, they came from France, they came from Germany, they came from the United States. And they formed what we could call the second generation. The second generation of analytical psychologists, Jungian analysts, came to Zurich in the 1920s and the 1930s, and they studied with Jung. Many of them were in analysis with Jung. And if not with Jung, then with Emma Jung or with Tony Wolff. And in those days, there were no training institutes. So if you wanted to become a Jungian analyst, there also was no such persona identity in the world at that time. But if you wanted to practice as a psychotherapist using the methods of Carl Jung of Zurich, you had to come to Zurich. You had to work with Jung or one of his close colleagues here for a period of time. And once he got to know you and could vouch for you and trust your work, he would give you a letter. And you could put that on your wall, and the letter would say that you were qualified to practice in the method of C.G. Jung. And so there are a number of these letters floating around the world, but they were given to the second generation. People like Esther Harding, who was English, a psychiatrist, medical doctor, ended up going to New York, living in New York, and she's the founder of the New York Society of Analytical Psychology, Psychological Club there. Eleanor Bertine, another New York analyst, medical doctor also. Christine Mann, another American medical doctor. I think she was the first female graduate from Cornell Medical School. Her father was a very well-known Swedenborgian minister in the United States. And she came to Zurich for a period of time and worked with Jung, and you actually can read about her analysis in one of Jung's books. I think it's in volume 9, The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, where he discusses the individuation process of a woman who was in analysis, and that's Christine Mann. She's the one who paints the beautiful pictures and that are actually printed in color in the collected works. There isn't very much colorful in those black books, but in that particular volume, the publisher went all out and printed those lovely paintings of hers in color. The library in the New York Institute is named after her. It's the Christine Mann Library. A man named H.G. Baines from England came and worked with Jung, and he was the founder of the Jungian movement in London. Some years later, in the 1930s, Michael Fordham came to Zurich, studied for a while. He was in analysis with Baines, and then later with Hilda Kirsch. James Kirsch and his wife Hilda left Germany in 1933, fled Berlin, moved to Palestine, then to London, finally to Los Angeles, where James Kirsch was the founder of the Jungian movement in Los Angeles. Joseph Wheelwright and Joseph Henderson, the two Joes, Americans from California, came and studied with Jung in the 1930s and ended up founding the Jungian movement in California and San Francisco. And that's how it went. So this was the second generation forming in those years. And how did they train? Well, Jung gave seminars at the Psychological Club every week on Wednesdays. They're famous. They're now published, many of them. The vision seminars, the dream seminars, Zarathustra seminars. They would sit in on these seminars and listen to Jung, enter into discussions and dialogues, practice their own individuation while in analysis with one of the Jungians over here. Many of them would stay at the Hotel Sonne in Küsnacht. Jung lived in Küsnacht. Joe Henderson told me one time, on a summer's day, if you went out on the balcony of the Hotel Sonne in Küsnacht in the morning, you would see a bunch of people sitting out there writing down their dreams, having active imaginations, maybe painting pictures. These were all people who were in analysis with Jung, who was just down the road. And so there was a group of people from all over the place by that time coming to Zurich and studying with Jung. And so by the end of the 1930s, when the Second World War broke out, again, Switzerland was cut off from the rest of the world. Their work went on in these other cities. And they started forming groups of people around themselves and gradually beginning to train other people. There were still no training institutes until after the Second World War. And there we find Jung entering into his now 65 years old in 1940, 65, and 1950, he's 75. During the 1940s, first half was, of course, occupied by a horrendous bloodbath in Europe. Switzerland survived largely unscathed physically because it was a neutral country. But Europe was left in shambles after 1945, and it took a long time for it to recover. And in those late 1940s, small institutes began to spring up, first in Zurich, then in London, San Francisco, New York. And formal training to become a Jungian analyst began at that time. And the works that were used, what did they study? Well, Jung's writings largely had been not translated from German. There were some translations of some of his works, Psychological Types, 1921. Big book was translated into English quite rapidly. So they had that. They had some of his essays. And then in some places where the leading figure could read German, they would have seminars. James Kirsch held weekly seminars for, I don't know, 50 years or so in Los Angeles, I think. Tom Kirsch's son told me they made audio tapes of all of these, and he's got boxes and boxes of them, doesn't know what to do with them. But James Kirsch would read from Jung's works in German, line for line, and translate them into English. And they got trained in his living room. That's how training took place in Los Angeles, until an institute was finally formed, and there were a few others who could participate in it. And so that's how it grew up in various places, rather informally at first, and then with much more structure, so that by the time Jung died in 1961, analytical psychology had established itself as a field with training institutes in quite a number of cities. It was international. There was an international organization, it was founded in 1955, called the IAP, the International Association for Analytical Psychology, which is today the large umbrella organization for Jungians worldwide. And that began in Zurich. It was created as a present for Jung's 80th birthday in 1955 and given to him at that celebration. It holds congresses every 3 years. The last one was in Montreal last year. The next one will be in Copenhagen in 2013. And there have been about 20 congresses by now. And so the field of analytical psychology, upon Jung's death, had considered considerably more figures in it than he would have ever imagined possible when he started out in his modest quarters on Gemeindestrasse in Zurich at the Psychological Club. It had international visibility, it had training programs in place, and when Jung died in 1961 on June 6th, I think he could die with the feeling that his work would continue, carried on by the generation that he had trained and that now was training further generations. I consider myself of the fourth generation. You establish your generation by looking at your analyst and then finding out who his or her analyst was, and so on back till you get to Jung. So my analyst was someone who was in analysis with a second generation who was in analysis with Jung. I'm fourth generation. People I train are in the fifth generation, so we're into the fifth and even sixth generations by now. Now, if we go forward from 1961 to 1970, and I've divided this more or less into decades, we can see that the decade immediately after Jung's death was dominated by the second generation. They were very, very powerful figures, strong teachers. When I came to Zurich in 1969, they were largely still in place. A few of them had passed away by then, but the great figures like Barbara Hanna, Mary Louise von Franz, C.A. Meyer, Yolanda Jacobi, and some others were still very active in teaching. But a third generation was beginning to come on the scene, and they gradually took over in the next decade as the second generation faded. Now, when I say faded, they faded slowly. They tended to get very old and die in their chairs. They never retired. I think Yolanda Jacobi, it was said, saw her patient, closed the door, went, sat down in her chair, and died. I mean, and she was like 85 or so. That's the way it would go. I think James Kirsch was the same. He died in his 80s, having seen his patients the day before, and so on. They just didn't retire. And Mary Louise von Franz actually lived into the 1990s, but she was very ill after about 1980. And so they faded gradually. Their influence remained. Their books continued to be read and studied. And of course, they promoted and carried on what is known as the classic tradition of Jungian analysis. But in the late 1950s and the 1960s, a rift appeared within analytical psychology between what was called the Zurich School and the London School. And the London School favored some psychoanalytic ideas and practices to the extent that they actually, in some cases, it was said they became more Kleinian than the Kleinians. They were very, Michael Fordham was very interested in the work of Donald Winnicott, Winifred Bion, and some of their students and followers. He brought their influence into the Jungian circles in London. And they changed their practices from the Zurich practice of face-to-face sessions with a frequency generally of twice a week, focusing largely on dreams and active imagination, fantasy material, and so on, to using the couch in the Freudian way with a frequency of 4 or 5 times a week, analyzing transference largely, and delving into spending most of the time on early childhood issues. This was a very strong departure from the Zurich School. And so battles ensued in these years in the IAP congresses between the London Jungians and the Zurich Jungians, and they called each other bad names and wanted to expel each other and so on and so forth. It was a little bit like the Protestants and the Catholics during the Reformation. But eventually they did not split, and gradually in the 70s and 80s, some rapprochement, some ability to hear the others, some ability maybe to assimilate some of these influences in a mild way on both sides started taking hold. It was also the age in those years of having to get over Jung. Jung was such a towering figure in to those second generation people that they literally could almost do nothing but quote Jung. Mario Jacobi told me that when he studied at the Institute in the early years, in the 1950s and early 1960s, if a question came up in a seminar that the teacher couldn't answer readily by quoting Jung, they said, well, we're going to have to wait on that. I'll give Professor Jung a phone call before the next session and we'll get the answer. So they didn't want to venture very far out from Jung's teachings. But I think that was important at the time. It built a very solid foundation. They certainly knew their Jung well, and they could quote him at great length. I often heard Marie-Louise von Franz say things in her lectures or read them in her books, and it sounded very original to me. And then I would read in one of Jung's casual essays or in one of his interviews, he had said exactly the same thing 30 or 40 years earlier, and she was repeating it. But she must have had a photographic memory, and she was very close to Jung, and not to say that she didn't extend Jung's thinking in her own very imaginative way in her writings on fairy tales and in a book called Number and Time and other works, but she was very close to Jung to the extent that it was almost an identification with his spirit, I would say. She could quote him as though he were speaking. And that was a wonderful thing about studying at the Jung Institute in those days, because even though Jung was dead, you could still hear him from the grave, so to speak, through the second generation students. And Barbara Hanna was full of stories about Jung and would regale the students in her lectures. She was deaf, so she couldn't answer questions, but she could speak very well, and she had a good memory. And the wonderful thing about her was that no matter what Jung said or did, and no matter how hurtful it might have been to her at the time, she always took it as a teaching for her betterment. He would sometimes say very nasty things to people. Jung had a fierce temper, and he was famous for flying off the handle from time to time. But she said, I remember in one lecture very clearly, she said, but he never spoke out of anger just for the sake of anger. It was always to teach us a lesson. And I think that's the way she took it. It's the way John Calvin would take the difficulties that his body was giving him and that his enemies were giving him. These were all teachings from God, who had arranged this for his betterment and for his improvement. And that's the way Barbara Hanna looked at Jung's teachings. So we got that very straight in those years from the second generation. But things were beginning to change, even in Zurich, and had changed quite drastically in London. And getting over Jung was the project of the third generation, I think. They really had to get past this enormous influence in order to broaden the field. Otherwise, the field of analytical psychology, I think, would have remained very narrow, very deep, very interesting, but quite narrow, and it needed to broaden out. And the British were the first to broaden it. Some people said they went too far, but they certainly brought a lot of other influences into the field. And in their journal, the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which was founded by Michael Fordham, he published papers, largely clinical papers, that showed how some Jungian ideas could be used in a very original way, in a very different way from the way the Zurich Jungians were using this. He included also the analysis of children, which had not been done very much in Zurich. Children and adolescents. Fordham was trained as a child psychiatrist, so he worked quite a lot with children. And he attempted to spot the self in symbols of the self in the creative drawings and pictures that children would make in his office. And this was a very original contribution, and I think showed his great respect for the autonomy of children, the selfhood of children. That children are not just the products of influence. They bring something into the world, something original. They bring a self with them. And I think this was very important for Jungians to hear and to understand deeply, that we all come with an eternal soul and we bring this into the world with us. And yes, we are subject to all kinds of influences from our parents and our families and our culture, but we also have a resource within ourselves, deeply within ourselves, that is original. That's our original selfhood. And later in life, it's a struggle to get a hold of that, get back to it. That's part of the task of a good Jungian analysis, to get a hold of that original selfhood, pristine, undamaged, untainted by the harsh experiences that we often have to endure as children at the hands of our teachers or even our parents or our brothers and sisters. So this was a very important contribution from London on Michael Fordham's part. And the London School did bring in the study of childhood, importantly, infancy and childhood, into the perspective of analytical psychology. In London at the Tavistock Clinic, where Fordham taught and worked for a while, and many of the Jungians have been involved, and in our next seminar we will actually have a site at the Tavistock Clinic with Warren Coleman, who is a London analyst trained at the SAP, the Society of Analytical Psychology in London. It's a famous clinic, psychoanalytic clinic in London, and Michael Fordham and Winnicott and Bion, all of them, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, they all worked there. Michael Fordham introduced the discipline into the training at the Society of Analytical Psychology, the discipline of infant observation, so that all the students who trained there had to observe the interactions between infants and their mothers. Observe, not therapize. They were not the therapists of these couples. They were there to learn, to see how mothers and infants relate to each other, how they react to each other, how they bond with each other, and to see this live. That was Fordham's idea, that you have to actually see the interaction with your own eyes and try to see what's going on there, try to understand what's going on there in a phenomenological way. And so that the study of infancy and the early years of attachment has been a long and consistent contribution from the English school to this day, where Jean Knox, for instance, wrote a very important book on attachment theory, recent discoveries in attachment theory, and the theory of archetypes, the theory of essential human patterns laid down since time immemorial, and how these come into play in the early interactions between infants and their mothers, and how if this does not happen well and goes wrong, all kinds of subsequent psychological problems are the result down the line as individuals get older and develop their various neuroses. Then in the third and fourth generation, there was a very strong movement to integrate some of the aspects that, some of the changes that were going on within psychoanalysis. During Freud's lifetime and during his second generation of followers, Freudian psychoanalysis was a very strict and very rigid, one-sided form of treatment. You had to really comply with very rigid rules and lie on the couch and be interpreted 5 times a day, 5 times a week, 5 days a week. Analysts largely silent, sitting behind you. Woody Allen had a wonderful line. He said, you know, my analyst, after 20 years, finally said something that really moved me. The other day he said, no habla inglés. So you wouldn't hear very much from these Freudian psychoanalysts sitting behind you. Every now and then, once a month or so, maybe an interpretive comment, but you could make of that what you will. But that changed radically in their next generations, and so they developed a lot of new schools of thought as well. I lived in Chicago for 25 years, and in Chicago there was a very strong renegade, if you will, or heretical movement. Ended up with the name self-psychology. Heinz Kohut moved from Europe. I think he was from Hungary, originally trained in Berlin, I believe. Not sure about his background, but he ended up in Chicago, the Psychoanalytic Institute, and he became increasingly dissatisfied with this rigid way of proceeding, and so he started toying around with some other options, and he focused particularly on problems of narcissism and the narcissistic personality disorder, as it's come to be known, and problems of self-esteem. And these were very deep problems with some of his patients, but they wouldn't really get addressed in a classic Freudian psychoanalysis. So he did 2 analyses on one of his patients. I think it was a student of his. He did a classic Freudian analysis, lasted 4 or 5 years, and then a little while later the person came back for a second analysis, and then he did a different approach. And this analysis worked much better, he felt. And in this analysis he really took up the idea that the self suffers from damages due to neglect, due to attack or wounding, childhood abuse, parents not paying any attention, overlooking, if not worse, so that the person grows up with a very frail sense of security, inner security and self-esteem. And they may be very gifted, they may be very talented people, even very successful people, but inwardly they don't feel that way. Inwardly they feel very shaky and very shallow. They feel very needy. They feel like they always need affirmations from somebody else. It's like the self isn't inside them, it's outside them. And so they have to be mirrored, they have to be admired, they have to be idealized in order to feel okay within themselves. And so these are the kind of problems he worked with. And the key to his work really was the empathy of the analyst. That classic Freudian analyst showed no empathy, hard as a rock, and silent. Very difficult for a person with low self-esteem to work in a classic analysis. With Kohut, it changed. The analyst became more active, became much more empathic, more understanding, mirroring, and he found that he got a lot better results, particularly with this particular kind of problem. Well, when he wrote his book on the analysis of the self, the 1970s, of course, living in Chicago, everybody was exposed to Kohut. He incidentally was banned from teaching at the Psychoanalytic Institute in Chicago. They took away his key to the bathroom. That was the big insult. He could no longer use the bathroom at the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago. So he formed his own group, his own school, and they called it self-psychology. Very gifted people, and very, very active in establishing a whole new branch, a kind of separate movement within the world of psychoanalysis, within the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, and so on. So yet another movement, the ones in London called the Middle School, Winnicott and so on, had developed some other options in London. Now from Chicago was coming self-psychology. And Jungians were becoming interested in this also. And living in Chicago, of course, and I was in the early years of setting up the Institute in Chicago, we were all exposed to Kohut's ideas because our students brought it to us. They had gone through university programs and so on, and all studied Kohut. He was the hot item on the block, and everybody in the universities were reading him. So we also started studying Kohut, and in Zurich, famously, Mario Jacobi became very interested in comparing the self-psychologist's view of the self, the vicissitudes of the self, and how they work with the self and with self-esteem, with the Jungian idea of the self and how Jungians work with these similar issues. And he wrote a book on Jungian psychology and the theory of narcissism, which was very well received by Jungians. And he is in the third generation. His analyst was Yolanda Jacobi. That's not his mother. They weren't even related. Spell their names differently. But she was a second generation analyst came from Vienna to Zurich in the 1930s and worked with Jung and was very instrumental in setting up the Jung Institute in Zurich in the late 1940s. But she was too late to participate in this kind of integrative movement with some of the new developments in psychoanalysis. But Mario Jacobi picked up the ball, and he is a very important figure within Jungian psychology and Jungian work because he's a bridging figure. He lives in Zurich. He was one of the main training analysts here for many years. He celebrated his 85th birthday last year, and we celebrated him at ISAP a couple of weeks ago at our opening tea for the spring semester. He's 85 going on 86, still very sharp and active. And he has written 5 or 6 books that helped bridge the divide between Zurich and London. And I think he was an harbinger, an early spring bird of what was to come, because in the years following his work, his writings in the 70s and 80s especially, Many other Jungians started incorporating insights, methods from other fields, including modern psychoanalytic fields, object relations, which came from England, self-psychology, which started in Chicago and spread very rapidly elsewhere after that. And then in the work of somebody like Donald Kulshed, who wrote an important book on trauma, Jungian approach to the therapy with early trauma, patients who suffered early traumas in their childhood. Very important book called The Inner World of Trauma. Inner World of Trauma, Donald Kulshed. You see an exquisite interweaving between the schools of modern psychoanalysis that he picked up and learned from in his training in New York, and retaining a fundamental Jungian view of the self and the human spirit, and describing from a Jungian perspective and using Jungian methods, theories and so on, describing how early trauma affects the life, the psychological life of adults who come into analysis and whose early wounds have to be treated. And so this has been a very important development, the work with trauma, early trauma within the field of Jungian psychotherapy within the last 15 years. And now especially after 1990, with the end of the Soviet era and the astonishing opening, nobody had expected, a total black swan. Nobody had thought would happen, that in our lifetime Germany would be reunited, we could visit Russia, we could teach in Russia, Russians could become Jungian analysts. This all opened up after 1990, and the Russians who'd been reading Jung secretly, at great risk to themselves, passing texts of Jung under the table to each other, Xerox copies of his books, stolen from libraries. If they'd been caught, they would have been sent to the Gulag. Suddenly we're out in the open, and we're clamoring for, hungry for feeding from the West. And so Tom Kirsch, who was president of the IAP, 1990-91, that period, started getting us to go to Russia and translating Jung's works into Russian. And so in the course of the 1990s and until today, there's been a very active involvement of Jungians in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow. I've been there many times myself. The British have been very involved, very dedicated to teaching and training in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Hardship tours. These are not joyrides. These were really difficult years. It's a little easier now. The hotels are a little better and the accommodations, but in the early years it was really tough. And to the point that there are now, I think, 30 or so trained Jungian analysts in Russia, with another 30 or 40 candidates in training in these two cities. And we have colleagues now going to Siberia and Krasnodar and places we never heard of before, where there are psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers who want to train to become Jungian analysts. So it's very exciting. A whole new world opened up. And with it, a tremendous, tremendous need to take on board the treatment of traumatized cultures, traumatized families. I've heard probably 100 cases in supervision and in case reports in Russia and Eastern Europe, and I can't think of a single one where there wasn't major trauma to the family from the time of the Russian Revolution through the Second World War, through the Stalinist years, through the Gulag, horrific experiences that are carried in through the generations and that are now coming to the surface as people are able to talk and remember and think about for the first time, think openly, and let themselves feel their way into what happened to them. And so the work with trauma, not only on an individual level, but on a collective, on a family level, on a collective level, has been such an important part of the work in that part of the world. Similarly, of course, people in Israel, analysts in Israel who've dealt with second and third generation families of the survivors and not survivors, have had to pay very careful attention to how trauma is passed on through the generations, and how it affects people's lives, and how to try to restore some semblance of wholeness in these very, very damaged psychic milieus, psychic systems. And finally, in these last years, I would say within the last 10 years, very importantly, some other material has come into the field of analytical psychology and has begun to be integrated into the work of analysts. And I'm thinking now of neuroscience, the study of the brain, as it plays a part in our emotional life, in our mental life, in our sleeping life, in our dreaming, the study of the brain at sleep. Very interesting research has been done, what's going on in the brain while we're sleeping and dreaming. And bringing this into the theoretical context of analytical psychology. A number of books have been written in that field. Many papers and articles at congresses have been presented. And so Jungian analysts are now becoming very interested in neuroscience and how it affects and how it plays a role in our work with patients. And finally, to consummate and culminate this part of our seminar, I'm going to refer to this book, I think, that Steve mentioned earlier. I can put it on this little thingy here. And this is a book that I edited. It contains chapters by about 40 Jungian analysts worldwide. I sought out who I thought were the best people to write on the various subjects, and I assigned them their subjects, and I asked them to write their contributions in an individual way, using their own voice, using their expertise and their experience in their areas. And I think it's I'm so pleased with what they produced, and I'm so proud of this book. I didn't write most of it myself. I edited it, I worked with them, I found them, and I sought them out, and I worked on their papers with them, and I wrote introductions to the various sections of the book. But this really represents the field in this generation. And I think now that we're in the third, fourth, fifth generation, it's a very strong generation. It's different from the second generation because we aren't as narrow, we aren't as conflicted, we're much more embracing of differences and other ideas and other perspectives. But I think we are holding true to the basic line of Jungian thought, which is very subtle and hard to define in many ways, but it is a kind of faith in the psyche, that the psyche is strong enough to overcome a lot of obstacles, that it offers us hints and clues about how it can be healed if we listen and pay attention to dreams and active imagination, that by entering into a relationship with a caring analyst or therapist, people can recover from their traumas and their wounds, there's a kind of basic faith in the system, faith in the psyche, and a view that the psyche is forward-looking. It does look back. We replay a lot of our lives. We repeat a lot. It's very hard to get out of old patterns and break them. But there is resource. There is resource in the psyche. And this faith in the psyche, I think, is what's fundamental to Jungian work. That's why Jungians don't create programs for psychotherapy. 10 sessions, here's what you do in the first and second and third sessions. We don't do it that way because each person is different. We want to see what's available to them, where they've come from, where they've been, what their history has been. We want to listen carefully to their past and their present. And we want to think about where the psyche can help them overcome their problems and their complexes. And we want to help them find their way forward. So it's a kind of forward-looking, basically, I would say optimistic psychology, depth psychology, that tries to move people into the future without losing track of the past. I read Jung's works a lot, and I teach from them, and I write about them. And one thing that strikes me over and over again as I study his works is how important it was for him to find roots in history. But not only in his personal history and his own family history. I don't think that was exceptionally important to him. He certainly had a good recollection of his childhood. He gives a good account of it in his autobiography. But I mean roots in the intellectual tradition of thinkers who have pondered the problems of the soul for a long, long time. The philosophers, the theologians, the mythologers, the imaginers, the poets, the artists, the folk wisdom that comes out in fairy tales and folk tales. He thought there is a need for us to connect deeply to the past, not just to our personal past, but deeply to the past. And that will help us go forward into the future without losing ourselves. Felt it's very dangerous to cut ourselves off from our roots. So finding the roots, that famous and wonderful television series, when was it, back in the 80s or 90s, Roots, of the man who goes back to Africa to find his own racial roots, his family's roots in the deep past, to find our cultural roots, because that is a part of our identity, and we can build on that, and we can build on that in a much more solid way than we can build on only using our personal history. So Jung wanted to locate his psychology within a tradition of thought, and where he found his ancestors, his spiritual ancestors, were in the Gnostics, ancient Gnostics who had original religious experiences and visions, who experienced the spiritual world in very original ways. That Jung was very interested in religious experience, but real experience, not just learning catechism from books, but real experience. He found in the Gnostics, far away, 2,000 years ago, and then he found a link between the Gnostics and himself in the alchemists, and the alchemists extending this tradition of inner work and visionary work, working on the soul and on the psyche, extending it from the ancient Gnostics into the 17th century, and then the Enlightenment, more or less putting that to the side, and Jung picking it up importantly in his depth psychology. So the roots of analytical psychology go back much further than to Freud. They go back into Western history, into spiritual history, religious history for thousands of years. And that Jung felt was a true foundation to build on. And when one works on oneself deeply, and I'll come to this after the break, one discovers some of those roots also in a quite personal way. Some of those distant patterns and roots in one's own dreams and active imagination. And that links one also in an individual and personal way to what Jung was talking about in his so many of his writings. I think probably people are ready for a break now, and what I'd like you to do is during the break to come up with some questions about questions that you might ask, you'd like to ask me about Jungian psychotherapy, or questions that some people have asked you and you couldn't answer about Jungian psychotherapy. However you'd like to pose these questions, and we'll, after the break, we'll start with those, and then I'll move into another section of the seminar.
So let me read an email question first, and then I'll ask Mexico if they have a question or two, and then we'll ask Asheville. So if people can be thinking through their sites, and then we'll go back to Murray's presentation. The first email question I'd like to ask will take me one moment to pull up. And this is from Kathleen in Los Gatos, California. And her question is, as a psychotherapist in training with a sincere passion for all things Jungian, could you please help me and the audience by sharing how to introduce a new client/patient to the Jungian therapeutic experience? In other words, what to say to a new client that will be both encouraging and educational about the journey they are about to embark on. Any thoughts on that, Murray?
In my experience, some people come to see me as a helper, psychotherapist, don't know anything much about my background or professional interests or training, just come with a problem. And that kind of person would be one type to introduce to Jungian work. And then there are those who've been reading a lot, who've been studying, and they want to go on the inner journey, they want to become individuated, so on. They have some of the language already, and that's a very different kind of person to introduce. I don't do very much introducing, actually. I try to get a process going and let it grow and go until there is a need to explain something or there is a question. But the first thing I want to know is what brings you here? What is the problem? And where are you suffering, or how are you dealing with it, and how have you dealt with it? So the entry into the analytic process is gradual. It's like getting into a bath slowly, let's say. Of course, if somebody wants to know at the outset, where are we going and what is this trip going to be like, one can give some kind of general idea, but it's never what you think it's going to be. And if it were, it wouldn't be genuine. I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't trust it. You know, you can fake analysis. You do all the right things. You bring dreams. You look very interested in what the analyst is saying. You look up symbols and symbol dictionaries. And John Hill told an interesting anecdote at the celebration for Mario Jacobi a few weeks ago. He said he went to see Mario for analysis. He was in training, and he had been with another analyst before, and so he was a trained analysand. He was trained to type make notes of his dreams, make an extra copy for the analyst, bring the analyst the copy, and then they would sit there and work on the dreams. And the analyst would say something and he would say something. So he tried this with Mario. Mario was silent, didn't say anything. And so he was very upset and angry. He came back the next time. This went on for several sessions, and finally he was ready to quit. And but he got angry at Mario, and he said, "Why don't you say something? Like, I'm bringing you all this material. What do you want?" And Mario said, "Well, I just want to hear a real voice speaking to me. I want to know who you are." It took a while to get to that point of truth, so that we aren't just playing a game at doing analysis. So sometimes there's that kind of a problem. That's pretty rare in my experience, but it does happen, especially with people who have done quite a bit of reading or who are maybe wanting to become trained. They will start that way. And then it's a process of breaking that down and waiting until the real thing emerges and the real thing happens. So, and the real thing is when you start showing real emotion in the sessions, and real feeling comes into play, and real tears, or suffering, or laughter, or and you can feel the difference. You know when that's happening, and when you aren't just going through some motions. It's like other things that you do in life. You can go through the motions, it looks pretty good, but it's not real. You want the real thing in analysis, and a good analyst can tell the difference for sure. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I don't do very much work on introducing. If there is something to do in that regard, I might refer to a book or to an article, or go to a lecture, something like that. But I want to get the process started, so I would ask the person to watch their dreams, maybe to, if they're beginning therapy for the first time, to make an attempt to make some notes or write about their history, tell their story. Analysis is partly creating a narrative, a new narrative with a real voice in it. And so I would start like that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Let's go to Mexico City. Mexico, glad to have you with us. I know there were some problems initially, but glad that you're here. And do you have a question for Murray today?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. There's some feedback.
Yes.
Okay. I was reviewing the Map of the Soul book, and I something really catch my attention, and I wanted Murray to comment on that a little bit. When he says that more than the encounter with the shadow, in analysis, the encounter with the anima animus is really like the path or the bridge towards the unconscious, towards the self. And especially in what he mentions, some of the ways that you can encounter the anima or animus through projections on another person of the different sex, or I don't know if there's another example that he gives, but I would like him to comment a little bit about that encounter with anima or animus within the analysis, and how can it be worked. Just to comment on it.
Yeah. Well, in my book, I try to give space to each of these concepts, and like the shadow and the anima and the animus. And these were terms that when I started reading Jung, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I would have to keep looking in the index. What does this mean exactly? Anima. And then in reading further in Jung, I got introduced to the idea, well, it's sort of a wild woman figure. It's really interesting and fascinating. And Jung gives a reference to a very third-rate 19th century novel by Rider Haggard, who wrote a book called She, This is a story of a man who goes into the deepest, darkest Africa and finds a figure there who dies and is reborn in the flames like the phoenix, and she's a fascinating and seductive and irresistible woman, and destroys men, very dangerous. And so I got the feeling, well, this is very dangerous territory to step into. And Jung underlines that quite a few times. You know, if you get too close to these archetypal energies and figures and forces, you're liable to be swept away by emotional intoxication. And that's true. In life, when you meet a true animus figure, a woman meets a true animus figure, she will be mesmerized and not just attracted, mildly attracted, but become fascinated and lured and drawn and obsessed. Actually, what we see in the other isn't the other. It isn't the other person. I mean, you're seeing something there, but you're imagining much more than you're seeing, than you're perceiving. Your imagination takes over, and your imagination says, you know, if I could be with this person, life would be wonderful. I'd be in paradise. I would be high all the time. My life would be totally fulfilled. There would be no end to the paradisal experience. That's the fantasy, and it's a very powerful and very attractive and potentially very destructive kind of psychological phenomenon. It happens to all of us at one point in our lives or another. I had a tremendous anima experience when I was a teenager, and I went to see a film called, I think it was called Last Summer or something like that, and there was a beautiful blonde girl playing the role of a teenage sweetheart, and during the summer vacation she fell in love with a boy, and he fell in love with her, and unfortunately she got pregnant, so it was a rather sad, tragic thing that fell out from that. But from that film I walked away, and it took me 3 days to come back to myself. I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't imagine anything else. I was totally caught. It's happened to me a few times since as well. But what we try to do in analysis is maybe go into some of these areas, but in a much more careful and reflective way. I mean, it does happen in analysis sometimes that you have an animus projection onto your analyst, say, or I would have an anima projection onto a woman analyst, and I would feel very strong feelings of attraction and love and wanting to be with her and live with her and unite with her and have everything with her. But we have certain techniques for turning the flames down a little bit in analysis, because we have ethics rules, we have boundaries, we have interpretive tools that we can use, that we should use when it gets too hot in the vessel. We turn it down by doing something stupid or showing our ignorance, not being as great as she thought I was, and things like that, you know, to show a bit of reality. Because in fact, what is being projected is an important part of the soul. It's being put out into the other. It's imagined as there's a hook for it. And it is important to experience and to learn from. So we try to carry it for a while, and carry it well, and carry it responsibly, and hold it without enacting it or acting it out. And in that heat of affection and even love and strong emotion, transformations can take place. People can actually do important psychological work and healing work if that's managed well, because after all, love is a healing factor. If it doesn't destroy you, it doesn't kill you, it'll cure you. It's one of the most important experiences you can have in your life. and to love well, and to love deeply. The anima and animus experiences are basically, we could say, love, infatuation, intoxication experiences that pull with them into our consciousness all kinds of personal and impersonal material, all kinds of feelings, fantasies, and aspects of our soul come into play as a result of this. That's what I mean when I say in the book that the anima experience is can be such a powerful psychological and growing experience and healing experience. Now, the experience with the shadow is very different. When you experience the shadow, you shudder. You experience horror or revulsion or embarrassment or shame. You experience something awful. It can also be very powerful. And if you get close, as Jung says in his chapter on the shadow in Ion, if you get close to absolute evil, as he says, very few people have experienced absolute evil, it can also be very shattering because you are in the presence of something so demonic and so cold and so destructive that you are very threatened by it. What we mean by shadow integration and connecting with the shadow is, and integrating or holding the shadow and recognizing the shadow, is to find those parts of ourselves, or find in ourselves those very features that we can identify in people that we dislike, that we hate, that we fear, that we think are terrible, are destructive towards us, are envious of us, so on and so forth. If we can find in ourselves those very qualities that we see in the other, we might see the other a little more clearly, because they probably aren't as one-sidedly bad as we see them either. Reality is always a little more complex than what we see when we're in a strong projection, whether it's shadow or anima or anything else. When we're in the projection, we see only what we are putting out there, pretty much. And we can project also parental figures. That's the classic instance of projecting in the transference, that we project a parent figure. And that can be a positive parent, can be a negative parent. You can have had a terrible mother, and you go into analysis and you experience your analyst as horrible and frightening and threatening, and somebody you hate even. And that can be a very important experience of the negative mother, in order to redeem that part of yourself and find that part of yourself and overcome that part of yourself and get through that trauma and find out that the other person isn't really like that. And the complexity of the object, holding the object, the other, in a respectful way, whether it's positive or negative, is really a very advanced stage of maturation and individuation. So that if you have a very negative mother experience and you're around her and you are still caught in it, you can hardly bear to hear her voice or be with her. If you work on that and you get through it a bit, and you can integrate pieces of it, even to the point maybe of understanding, forgiving, seeing another side, you'll have a surprising discovery that when you're with her, she doesn't bother you quite as much. You aren't putting into her your old experiences. You're seeing her in the present more, and you're seeing her also as a suffering human being. Maybe somebody who did her best and couldn't do any better when you were little and she was young, and who knows what was going on. So this is the importance of taking back the projections, reclaiming the soul. And to reclaim the anima, or the animus, is such a big work and such an important work, but it's also where our creativity lies, and so that we don't put it out there into somebody else and chase after it. What we see in the other is a part of ourselves. That's the thing to remember. And how can we live that? How can we do something good for ourselves with it?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That was a very nice overview. Animus, and shadow. Want to take a piece for Asheville, a question or two. First hand was back there, so let's...
Murray, what do you think Jung or third, fourth, fifth generation Jungians, what would they, the diagnosis of a dissociative identity disorder, people who dissociate and have alters, where does that fit into Jung's thinking about how personalities integrate and anima, animus, and shadow, etc.?
Well, Jung himself was very interested in dissociation, and he did study it closely, and he could observe it in himself sometimes too. Everybody dissociates a little bit. You dissociate when you're in a traumatic experience to protect yourself, largely to pull back or to leave the situation. You dissociate when you don't want to remember something painful. But what you're talking about is a more serious type of dissociation where actually the personality splinters and you have several dissociated pieces of the personality that maybe don't even know of each other or don't speak to each other. This was quite closely studied by Jungians and many other people in the 80s and 90s with multiple personality disorders. And amazing phenomena were reported that, in one personality a person could be allergic to smoke, and another personality they're a chain smoker, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was really quite incredible what was being reported. And I supervised some cases. I never had a case of a full-blown multiple personality disorder myself, but I supervised a couple of cases where the person I was supervising was working with such and trying to build some bridges and connections between these various personalities. They're usually a different age, and they have different interests, and they have different weaknesses and different strengths. And building bridges between them and trying to establish some links is a very important part of the work. Now, if you look at Jung's writings about the unconscious, sometimes he talks as though we are all splinter psyches. We all have this kind of these pieces floating around in the unconscious. He sometimes talks about islands of consciousness, or the complexes, or broken off pieces of the personality that have been repressed or haven't been taken up by the conscious personality and integrated. And partly it's a normal state of affairs, and in extreme cases it's very pathological. In the more normal instances that we all participate in, we can dialogue with those figures. They are like other points of view that we can get in touch with. If you do active imagination, for instance, as you can read Jung's graphic account of it in the Red Book, but you can do it yourself, and you're successful at getting somewhere with it, which means that you actually have an experience that there is another voice in you, or another point of view, or a figure who doesn't see things exactly the way you do, or that extends your perspective out, and you can go and look through their eyes for a little bit, or talk to them. You do get this feeling that that you are made up of a complexity of inner figures. So we speak sometimes of a shadow figure. This might be represented in a dream as a nasty person, an enemy, somebody you dislike, a neighbor, or somebody you don't even know, who's threatening you and has horrible traits and qualities. And if you take that on a subjective level, as we say, in the interpretation of dreams, interpret it subjectively, and you say, this is a part of myself. It's a part of my own psyche. Maybe I can project this onto somebody else, but why don't I just take it as part of myself and see where I can go with it? And you enter into a dialogue with it and have a conversation with it. What you'll find usually is that if you start paying attention to it and showing interest in it, it will start changing and it will start coming towards you. And this is a part of integration, that you can close the distance in a way, while still maintaining some separateness and some difference. But the figures can become a part of your personality and your everyday functioning. And it can, if you have them available and you aren't too dissociated from them, you can step out of your ego and look at the world from their point of view. How does the shadow figure look at things? Or how does the anima look at things, or the animas? And it's a little bit also like working with your typology, your thinking type. What is your feeling function doing? Ask your feeling function. It's not so easy. Or one of your less developed functions. How does your sensate function look at the painting? How does your thinking function think about it? These are also parts or aspects. If they are very alien from your ego state, we could say that they are dissociated. And if they are actually represented by figures that you can't get in touch with, but come out spontaneously from time to time in emotional ways, when you're having a strong emotional reaction, you start shouting, throwing things, when normally you're a kind of quiet, calm person. We say you're possessed by your other personality, your complex. You're caught in the complex. And that isn't so bad necessarily, to let yourself go with the complex and then step back and reflect on it and say, wow, it's interesting what that person said. It's not exactly what I think, but I should maybe take that into account and listen to that, see what that point of view is. Because there's something there that I'm not in touch with normally. So this is a kind of roundabout way of addressing your question.
Thank you, Murray. Good. Let's take one question from Mark, and then maybe ISAP, Zurich students may have a thought. Mark, did you have a question?
Yes. Murray, I was wondering, with the popularity of the Celestine prophecy, the word synchronicity has come very much into our vocabulary. What did synchronicity mean to Carl Jung?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. I don't know about the Celestine prophecy, so I can't really comment on that. I know the title of the book, but I haven't studied it. Jung says, and you can't always go completely on what he says because maybe his memory is failing him, maybe there are other things that he didn't say that are also true, but he says that he started thinking about the relativity of time and space after having lunch with Einstein. 1912. Einstein was a student, later a professor, here in this university at the AJC, as was Wolfgang Pauli. Wolfgang Pauli was another one of the great physicists and founders of quantum mechanics. And Einstein was very interested in theory of relativity, and from the Jung was terrible at mathematics, as I said before. He couldn't follow Einstein's math, of course. Einstein himself says he wasn't very good at math, but I think that was just humility on his part. The guy who was really good at math was Pauli, and some other of those the hotshot physicists of the day. But he says he became interested in the relativity of time and space. And what he meant by that was that these categories that we set up in our minds about absolutes, time and space are absolutes. Time goes forward, space is space, it's boundaried. And Einstein said, no, the universe, light can bend, and it has curves, and it's more complicated than we think it is, and light travels at a certain speed, and if you see a star in the sky, that light left millions of years ago, and you aren't seeing the star as it is now. All that opened Jung's mind to the possibility of acausality, as he calls it. And what interested him was coincidences that happen to all of us. We've all experienced this. We say, God, what a coincidence that was. Coincidences that happen at certain moments in your life where something that you're thinking, or you've dreamed, or you've just passed through your mind, mentally, you have a mental experience, and at the same time, synchronously, same moment, or in a close proximity, something external to you happens, and your thought didn't create that. As far as you know, I mean, there is maybe telepathy. I'm sure you've all had the experience of picking up the phone and calling somebody, and the person says, God, I was just about to call you. Isn't that a coincidence? Well, maybe that's telepathy, maybe it's synchronicity. Synchronicity is a causal coincidence that's meaningful. It's meaningful to the person experiencing it. Now, you don't know if it's meaningful to the cosmos. Maybe it is also. And Jung had long conversations and extensive discussions with Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicity. And Pauli was very interested in it. And in quantum theory, I don't understand that much about quantum theory, but I read a little bit. There's something called non-locality and acausality and things like that, where things happen at the same time, kind of mirroring each other, but one doesn't cause the other, and yet they're intimately related to each other. Pauli and Jung thought, well, maybe there's some way to connect this perspective on the physical world that quantum physics was studying, with what I'm finding in the unconscious, where images come up from the unconscious spontaneously, come out of nowhere, come into our minds. He says from the unconscious, we just say popped into my mind, or an image came to me, or I'm in a conversation with somebody, we're having a conversation, and something happens that is uncanny, that is striking, that just sort of takes your breath away. And those experiences that are so meaningful, he called synchronicities. Those acausal coincidences that are meaningful, he uses this term. Now, he tried to study that quite carefully. He wrote an essay, quite a late essay in the 1950s about it. He gave some lectures about it. An example that he gives of synchronicity, that's a famous one, you've probably heard it, is that he was with a patient in his home where he worked in Küsnacht, and sometime if you're in Zurich and you'd like to go visit his home and see his library, that can occasionally be arranged in groups from ISAP. They go there. You'll see where he was sitting. It's a house on the lake, and there are windows that face out toward the lake, and he was sitting in that room with a patient, and the patient was telling him a dream that she had, and in the dream there was an image of a scarab beetle. Scarab beetle is an ancient Egyptian symbol for death and rebirth. I mean, the Egyptians were writing about that 3,000 years ago in their hieroglyphics. And Jung was very appreciative of Egyptian mythology and, the symbolism of it. But at the moment that they were discussing this dream image, and he was getting ready to expound on it probably, he heard a noise at the window, and he looked over to the window, and there, banging against the window, was a scarab beetle. And he said, they're very uncommon in this part of the world. On the lake in Zurich, you don't usually see a scarab beetle. And this coincidence between the dream image, conversation, and the scarab beetle coming together in that moment that he was talking to this woman about some deep issue in her life that probably had to do with death and rebirth, maybe. He doesn't give the clinical context, but one assumes something like that. Said it was very meaningful. He said changed the analysis in the sense that finally this person started taking her psychic material, her dreams, seriously. Because a lot of people, you know, when they come, it's sort of a game, like a parlor game. I'll tell you my dreams, and you get a little feedback from it. But to really take your dreams seriously, in the sense that we encourage people to do in analysis and integrate the dream messages into your life and so on, to take them seriously is quite a leap of imagination. It changes your life. And that's what this incident did for her. It wasn't just Jung's telling her, oh, this dream's very important, now you should pay attention to it. This synchronistic event. So the meaning is underscored. Now, when he discussed this with Pauli said, well, in science we can't talk about meaning. That's out of bounds. Science doesn't deal with the subject of meaning, but we can talk about coincidences. And Pauli was very interested in acausality, just things that happen sort of simultaneously that seem to maybe have something to do with each other but aren't related causally. But he wouldn't use the word meaningful. Jung, one of the few moments that he is ever metaphysical, because he really stays away from that subject. He would never say, I believe in God, for instance. He says, I know, but then you wonder, what does he know? He knows his experiences, but he was very shy of making any metaphysical speculations. But there is a moment in that synchronicity essay where, toward the end of it, he talks about objective meaning. And what he means by that is that there is meaning beyond our creation of meaning. That there is meaning in the fabric of things, in the cosmos, and that these coincidences, these synchronicities, are telling us something. Okay, that we don't have to make meaning. Meaning is made for us. It's handed to us. We have to recognize it. And synchronicities are a gift from the universe, you could say, that tell you something, that tell you maybe you're on the right course, tell you this is something to pay attention to, tell you maybe you should change something. He wants to say that the source of synchronicity lies beyond the individual psyche and lies beyond material causality, but it's objective. And that's one of the few times that I can find that Jung ever ventured out on a limb metaphysically, because it is a metaphysical statement. It isn't something you can prove, but it's a hypothesis you can have. You could say, when I have synchronicities, I'm going to really pay attention to them when they come into my life, because they're telling me something. And they're like messages from the other side, or they're messages from the cosmos, however you want to think about that. That's probably the Celestine prophecies, that we're getting messages from the cosmos and we need to pay attention to them. And I think Jung was inclined in that direction, but he was, as I say, very shy about talking about it, because his persona was that of a scientist and a psychoanalyst and a doctor, and he didn't want people to think he was wacko or had gone to California and stayed there too long or something, New Age. So he was a Swiss, serious état professor and scientist, but he ventured in this area of synchronicity. What did it mean to them? I think it meant a lot to him in his private life, and I think he touched on it in that essay on synchronicity. Now, other Jungians have written much more about it than he did. Like Mary Louise von Franz was a favorite subject of hers, and she was very good on the subject. If you read Number and Time, for instance, or some of her works on myths and fairy tales, you will see that she, and some of her other essays, and another person who was very good on synchronicity was a second-generation Jungian named Erich Neumann. And Erich Neumann was like James Kirsch and some others, a German Jew who left Berlin in 1933 And he migrated to Israel, and he was the founder of the Jungian movement in Israel, which today is quite strong. And he wrote some marvelous essays on synchronicity. He died, unfortunately, at quite an early age, around 60 years old in the 1950s. But of all the Jungians who write about synchronicity, he's one of my favorites because he really, he has a philosophical training and a philosophical background. I think he has a PhD in philosophy, in German philosophy. So he isn't afraid to venture out into philosophical territory. Jung was a kind of amateur philosopher, often criticized for not knowing enough philosophy. He had his favorites. He read Kant and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, but he wasn't a trained philosopher. But Neumann was, and Neumann can speak very convincingly about synchronicity, so I refer you to his work.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and hold questions. We do have a number of email questions still out there. There may be some IZAP, Zurich, ATH questions as well. We have about 30 minutes left. So, Murray, I'll turn it back over to you. You can go ahead and give the last section of your talk. And if you do have a quick ATH question at some point, feel free to integrate that in as desired. So we'll turn it back to you, Murray.
Well, I have a good question here, and I will answer it in the course of my next bit. We have 30 minutes to go. The question is, how is it that one becomes more oneself and separates from the collective, and at the same time becomes more connected more closely with others? That's a good question. So, in other words, that's the question about individuation. You know, we talk a lot in Jungian circles about individuation, and there's one view of it, I would say, a not very sophisticated view, let's say a kind of early approximation or early, where you start with the idea of individuation is that you become isolated, that you become separated out from the collective, you go into a monastery, or you sever relationships with other people and you navel gaze. I mean, that would be a gross oversimplification of what some people take to be individuation. But it goes in that direction of becoming more hermit-like. And for some people, that may really be the case. There are true hermits. You know, really what individuation means is finding your own way, becoming yourself. And for somebody who is quite introverted and hermit-like and needs to spend a lot of time by herself or himself, this would be a part of their individuation, to take that time and even to go on long retreats, whether they're organized by Buddhists or Christians or anybody else, but silent retreats, or go into a state of withdrawn libido from the world and into yourself for a period of time. But individuation also has another side, and that is to enter into relationships with the world that are based not so much, I can't say at all, not at all, but not so much on projection, more on realistic, let's say, appraisals, and more on real love than anima or animus infatuations. And in order to do that, one has to clear up one's projective mechanisms, what Jung called Maya, using the, he said, anima is like Maya, the Indian goddess who creates illusions, our illusion-making factor. We create worlds we'd like to have, or we create worlds we fear having, or whatever the emotion that's driving them could be. We do make up worlds in our heads, and we can't stop doing that. We have to make order out of what we experience. And in order to bring things into order, we often have to use the glue, so to speak, of illusion and projection. But we can minimize it somewhat. And so after some analysis of projections and this illusion-making factor, the anima or projections of shadow or whatever, we can enter into a better relationship, a more real, let's say an honest and realistic relationship to other people, where we actually can see them in their complexity. and maybe even accept them in their complexity. That is a huge achievement. I recently read this wonderful novel called Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, F-R-A-N-Z-O-N, I think. Ian Franzen, Jonathan Franzen. I think it's his second novel, was published within the last year or so. And it got some good reviews, so I bought it and just finished reading it. And I found it so moving at the end, where, and I won't give the ending away, but there is like a moment of acceptance of what is, that is really beyond any expectation. And you would never have predicted an ending like this. It's like a fairy tale ending. Not altogether believable, but terribly moving. And I think what he's driving at is the kind of maturity that can be reached by his characters in the novel, who probably represent aspects of himself. Novelists writing novels and doing active imagination aren't so different. You need a particular gift to write a good novel, of course, but you need the imagination for both. And the characters often take on a life of their own and represent parts of the self. And his characters evolve through a set of stages that you can see happening to them and in their relationships to this final moment of acceptance, where they can be with each other. They can truly be with each other and accept each other. Now that, I would say, is a high level of individuation, where you don't have to reject somebody you hate or fear. You can get through that, you can get past it, and you can see things as they are and embrace them. So what I want to talk in this last bit of the seminar about is a kind of overview or summary of what I see as stages of analytic work. And these are stages that can be reached partially or by some people to a great degree in a period of time. I mean, to go far with this does take a long time. There are no shortcuts, but you can go quite a long ways in a short period of time as well, depending on your gifts and your level of commitment. So I'm not really talking about length of analysis, but I'm talking about stages of analysis or analytic work, psychotherapeutic work, that can be carried out at any level of frequency over any length of time. And I must say I've worked with people from very short periods of time to very, very long periods of time. And the ones that I've worked with for a long time tend to show a kind of process that I don't see in people that I work with a short period of time, unless those people have been doing a lot of work before they get to me for that short period of time. And in those cases, I can see some of these features as well, these late features, you could say, of analytic or therapeutic work. And I want to talk about three stages. And I'm basing myself on a late work of Jung and a lot of his other writings, but what I have in mind is a chapter that he includes in his last great work called Mysterium Conjunctionis. It's a chapter called The Conjunction. And he talks about three stages of development in that chapter. And I've used these to think about stages in the process of analytic work. And to speak about the first stage, I'm going to use a couple of Latin terms that Jung pulls out of his sources, the alchemists and some of the medieval writers. Jung, of course, read Latin like I can read English, or you can read your native language. He read Latin, he read Greek, he could speak Latin. But that wasn't unusual in his day and with his education. The European education continued into the late 19th century and even into the 20th century, emphasizing the classics. So to him, these terms were very easy and familiar. And to us who read Jung for a long time, they also become kind of code words and suggest a lot in a few words. That's one of Latin's gifts. You can say a lot with just a few words. Massa confusa means a confused mess. A confused mess of material, like a turned over lunchbox or a slop pail or something, just a mess of stuff, unsorted out, unprocessed, but with potential. And so this is the stage of an unanalyzed, unpsychotherapeutized psyche coming to the therapist for the first time in a mess, okay, and confessing it, saying, I'm in a mess, I don't know what's up and what's down, I'm confused, and I have so many parts and pieces, I can't put them together, I can't make relationships happen, my life makes no sense to me, I have ups and downs, I'm all over the place with my emotions. That's massa confusa. And in our work, we say what massa confusa is a state of consciousness that has not gone through a process of differentiation, separation, ordering, naming, putting things in their place. When did this happen to you? Who did it to you? How bad was it? What did you learn from it? All those kind of things. You don't really have a narrative. It's just all over the map. That's the beginning point. But we have faith that the massa confusa has potential. And sometimes it's a great work to get to the state of massa confusa. Because before the massa confusa is exposed, it may be hidden by a kind of fake structure of I'm okay, you're okay. Everything's just fine. I have no problems. Well, why did you come to see me then for therapy? Well, there's one little problem I want to tell you about. And then it starts. And finally you get into the massa confusa. And that is a moment that every therapist looks forward to. It means that there's something happening here. Finally there's a breakthrough. And that's a good thing. Don Kalsha describes a moment like this in his chapter in this book, Jungian Psychoanalysis. He writes on trauma in here. And he talks about a patient who in a session just fell completely apart, started bawling and crying, and she said was so embarrassed because she was a financial expert and a vice president in a bank, and she said at the end of the session, my God, you'll never see me like this again, I'm such a mess. And he said, oh please, this is what you have to do, this is where you have to go, this is great. He saw the massa confusa, and she let herself have it. So that's an achievement. That's a letting go. Letting yourself trust the analyst to be able to hold and contain it. But that's where you start. And then over a period of time, you make a kind of inventory. And an inventory mostly of consciousness till you get to the place that Jung called unio mentalis. That's a one-mindedness. That's a unified mind. Where there is a solid structure of consciousness. There is an ego there. There is a person who can say yes and can say no and mean it. There is a person who's not totally driven by their emotions, although they can feel their emotions and let their emotions in, but they can contain their emotions, and they can read their emotions, and they can have ideas, and they can have thoughts, and they can finish projects. They have what we call ego strength, containment, follow through, enough patience and endurance to hold on to manage their sufferings. And that's a tremendous achievement, and that often takes quite a long period of time to arrive at insight and self-knowledge. The hallmarks of unio mentalis, Jung says, are self-knowledge. You know yourself, and you know your pieces and your parts, and you can name them. Often when people start in therapy, they can't even name their emotions. It's hard for them to put words on what they're feeling, and that's not their fault. It's a poor education. We don't have good educational system for emotions. We've got good education for other things, facts and math and science and so on, relatively speaking, but we don't have very much of an education for emotions. Artists, maybe. Artists, writers, poets. A poet has to learn to put words on emotion. So we can learn a lot from poets or writers like Jonathan Franzen. They can put words on feelings, and Franzen's words are so fresh. There isn't a cliche in that book. It's a thick book. I loved reading it, and I'm very sensitive to language. And so writers can give us a lot of words for our emotional states. And the unio mentalis, Jung says, using medieval terminology, is when the soul has been extracted from the body and united with the mind. Because the soul has a natural tendency toward the body and toward vagrant emotions, states of intoxication, states of wild abandon, looseness, dissociation, all of that. That's a kind of natural state. And this is an achieved state. This is a state that follows hard work. You have to apply yourself to achieve unio mentalis. You have to hold the inventory in your mind, and you have to exercise control and self-discipline and be able to say no to yourself. And so for a lot of people, this is almost impossible. For a good Protestant Calvinist, they learn it in Sunday school. This is, you discipline your instincts and your emotions, and that was a contribution of Christianity to psychological development, according to Jung. That when Christianity entered the picture, paganism was lost in massa confusa, and Christianity achieved unio mentalis, extracting the soul from the body, disciplining the soul, and connecting it to spiritual values. And so when you get a Calvinist or a Zwingli, Zurich Protestant, they've got enormous control over their emotions, too much control. But the danger there is that you start repressing it. You don't know what you're feeling anymore, and there's a kind of emptiness in your emotional life. That isn't what Jung wants to achieve by unio mentalis, but it is a kind of collection of the mind, so that you have a strong mind, and you can make decisions, and you can make those decisions happen. Now, the second stage is to practice unio mentalis. First stage is self-knowledge, and the second stage is practice and self-acceptance. Now, in the alchemical system that Jung is using as a metaphor to describe these stages, he says this is when the combination of the liquid that's been boiled off of the material that lies dead in the bottom of the flask, vapors arise and they unite at the top of the flask with air, and this combination of air and water, steam, that's unio mentalis, now drips back down into the body at the bottom and revitalizes it. So the body has undergone a kind of death during this process of disciplining. It's kind of harsh and it's tough. You put the reins on yourself to gain self-knowledge and achieve understanding of your shadow and all of that, and not act out. That's real tough-minded psychological integrity. Now, living it, taking it into life out of the analytic session and into daily practice. So you go into life with self-knowledge, but you live your life. And you live your life as fully as you can. And that includes your love life, your anima life, your animus life, your adventures, but with an unio mentalis attitude. So you don't leave that behind. You don't regress back to the massa confusa in the second stage, but you make it work for you. So that you take real decisions in life, and you enter into relationships in a more conscious way, and a more deliberate way, and a more, let's say, restrained way, in a more conscious way. And you reflect on yourself more. So now you're actively participating in life, you're in the world, and you are participating in the world in a conscious way as an individual. So you can go back into your family of origin and you can work things out. It's a wonderful chapter in Franzen's book where the female character goes back into her family of origin who had been devastating, just done her in completely, and she organizes their life for them. She puts things in order there because she's achieved something through her therapy. She actually goes into therapy in the book, so I'm pushing the book, I guess, but I think she really got somewhere in her therapy. She achieved a state of unio mentalis so she could sort things out also for other people without getting into their complexes, without going wild herself. When they started doing their thing with her and started trying to drag her back into childhood dynamics, she didn't go there. That's what it means to live the unio mentalis and make a body out of it. Reconnect it to the body and live it. So this stage of analysis sees the person actually taking the lessons that have been learned and the self-knowledge that has been gained through the analysis of history and consciousness and so on, shadow, and using it in the world. Now, so far, I haven't talked about delving very deeply into the unconscious. This is the unio mentalis, achievement of unio mentalis, delves at least to the shadow phase of consciousness, to see the dark side of the ego, one's selfishness, one's greed, one's envy, one's competitiveness, all that kind of stuff, one's coldness. That's the shadow. Shadow is fundamentally cold selfishness. We like to pretend we're not that, but our shadow is that. Or if you are that, maybe your shadow is altruistic and loving, so-called positive shadow. But for most people, the shadow is unbelievable amount of selfish self-interest. And so one faces that and takes it on board and puts it into line with other things that one also is. It doesn't dominate you, but you know it's there and you don't let it rule you. And so this achievement of unio mentalis and making it happen in the body and in life is more or less an achievement of consciousness, attaining consciousness of the shadow and being able to use it and make it work. It also comes into play in the analytic work, where once a person is here, they can be much more realistic about themselves. They can be much more self-critical. The analyst doesn't have to criticize them or point out things that, when Franz said, whenever you get close to the shadow in analysis, you have to practice bush politics. You don't go directly at it, you go very quietly and you raise a white flag and let somebody know you're there and go very slowly, because if you go at it directly, they'll kill you. They think you're the enemy. So when you try to interpret shadow in analysis, you have to go very cautiously. But at this stage, a person can interpret their own shadow. They can fess up. They don't need the analyst to do that work. And so it's a much more, let's say, honest self-reflection. I'm not kidding myself anymore. I can be with you in a real way, and I can reflect on my life, and also with you. I can tell you my opinions about you. I don't have to pretend. So there's a kind of honesty and integrity that enters into the analytic process in this stage also. And if this is achieved, and this is all that's achieved, my goodness, it's a lot. It's a tremendous amount. But Jung didn't want to stop there. And I think in his own life he didn't stop there. And if you go long enough in analysis, you won't stop there either. Because what comes after this is the deeper work with the anima and the self. And that means going into areas of the mind that are collective, not personal. The collective unconscious, as Jung called it. Symbols, ideas that don't belong to you but are big, are important, are numinous, are life-enhancing, life-changing, and they aren't only there for you. You can engage them and you can draw from them, but they aren't yours. It isn't your life. The collective unconscious contains you. You don't contain it. You are in it. It's bigger than you are, but you can draw from it. And how do you draw from it? Well, occasionally you get it symbols of a numinous type in dreams, symbols of archetypal nature, big dreams as we call them. Those are offered in the course of analysis in dreams. They are dreams that you will remember for the rest of your life, and you will draw from for the rest of your life, and you will go out with when you pass away. They'll probably be close by if you've worked them and you worked hard on them. They are markers in your life. They're symbolic. They're the building blocks of your spiritual attitude and your symbol system. And you come to dwell in them, as Jung dwelled in the images that came to him during his Red Book period. You build a house with them. You make a structure out of them. They become your personal symbols for orientation, so you know where you are in the world. You know what the meaning of your small individual life is in the context of a much bigger world. You aren't located in just yourself. And here Jung speaks about connecting to the anima mundi. This is another Latin term that comes from the alchemists. Anima mundi. And that's the soul of the world. The soul of the world. It's a fine phrase and kind of highfalutin, but what it really boils down to is that you are connected to the big picture, the world as it is broadly conceived. We have people at ISEP now who are very, very interested in developing eco-psychology, ecology with a psychological consciousness. Call it eco-psychology or something like that, ecological psychology. And this is a sense for the world and for nature, but not on a surface level, on a deep level. And it comes through symbols and images. It doesn't come necessarily or primarily about reading what's happening to the rainforests in Brazil or the terrible situation in Japan with the reactors and all that. I mean, that's a part of it, but it's much deeper than that. It's a sense for the inside of the world's soul, for the inside of nature, for the anima of nature, the soul of nature. And so it's like an interconnection that develops through the symbols that one gets in this stage of the analytic work, through active imagination, dream work, and so on, that goes beyond the personal. It's impersonal, it's connecting to the world, it's connecting to life as such, it's connecting to the universe, and it's connecting to the meaning of humanity, for instance. Not just the meaning of my contribution, my little life that lasts a few years, but what is the purpose of humanity in the cosmos? What are we doing here? Why is it important that human beings are on this planet? Those kind of reflections, but with a conviction that it is meaningful, it is important. And Jung had a whole idea about that we're helping God evolve. We're helping a kind of cosmic consciousness to evolve. It needs human consciousness. We're like a plant that this big consciousness needs in order to realize itself in the cosmos. That was his idea about it. What are we doing here? We're here to help consciousness grow. We're plants for consciousness. And that's our job, that's our work. So if you do this work and you feel connected to the inside of the cosmos, you've advanced a long ways. You retain your ego integrity, your unio mentalis, your self-discipline. You put it to work in your personal life, back into the body of your life. You live your life energetically and courageously to the best of your ability, your personal life. And you connect via your symbols to a cosmic order and meaning. So it's a development of a symbolic meaning system. And this takes place in analysis through very hard work, long work. It doesn't happen overnight, but it has to do with also sharing this with at least one other person, the analyst. You don't have to broadcast it necessarily, but maybe you want to. some Jungians have written quite extensively about this level of consciousness. Lionel Corbett, an analyst in California who trained in Chicago, I know him very well, has written a couple of books on using your dreams to develop personal spirituality. He's about to publish a second or third book. He teaches at Pacifica, and he writes very well on this subject. So I can recommend his books. This is like the very advanced level of Jungian work. And what is the meaning of it? Well, you could say the meaning of psychotherapy is to help individuals live their life better, with more integrity, with more consciousness. But the meaning of this part of the work is to help the generations, to help the 21st century survive, to help the planet, to help humanity. It isn't only personal. And so Jungian psychotherapy goes into that direction of a kind of dedication to the bigger picture through the individual. Always working with individuals, or small groups maybe, but the individual is the door into this kind of greater consciousness. That's the path that Jung was very convinced that change would come about because enough individuals would become aware, and I think it's happening. I don't know, not through Jungian analysis necessarily only, but also, but just increasing awareness that big issues are at stake in our time, and not just personal ones, but how to work with them, how to grapple with them. And it isn't just about politics and demonstrations, it's also about a kind of imaginative, or reimagining what reality is like, and living accordingly to what we know are our limitations and our constraints and what we have to work with, and trying to live as deeply as we can with our grasp of meaning, personal and spiritual, cosmic. So on that note, right on the mark, I think I will say goodbye to you folks all over the world, and it's been a pleasure. Hi, Patricia. Hi, Mexico.
Rory, I'd like to
Thank you so much for today. It has been such a pleasure to have you here. We always enjoy these, and I know the audience today has enjoyed it as well. Want to remind folks that hopefully in June we'll be doing another one with the Tavistock group in London, as well as the ETH in Zurich, and we're thinking about perhaps a film study on Black Swan in August. So those are things we're looking at. So keep it tuned. We'll send out emails. There's a survey that will go out if you want to give us feedback about today. And thanks again, Murray, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Well, that was fun.
That was one of my big jobs.